Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. This is Anne. I'm the Adult Services Librarian at the E.D. Lott Public Library, and I am delighted to be welcoming Dr. Kaeli Swift here today to talk to us about corvids, crows, ravens, and other corvids. So I will turn it over to her, and thank you all for coming.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me this morning/evening for you. I am coming to you from a very different part of the world where it is actually Sunday at 8 a.m. But I thank you no matter where or when you are joining me for wanting to show up and talk about corvids. I'm going to just transition really quick to my screen share. All right, hopefully that looks good for everybody. So before we get too in the weeds with our crow stuff, I always like to start with just the really basic, what's the deal with crows and ravens? Because I know that this is a distinguishing these two birds can be a little bit tricky, even for more advanced birders, but especially for novice birders, because they are superficially very similar. So the answer is that in the United States, and across the world, crows and ravens are kind of catch-all names that actually encompass a variety of different individual species. So for example, here in the United States, we have common ravens, Chihuahuan ravens, fish crows, and American crows. And so of course, being different species, there are notable differences between those birds, but focusing just on the two most common ones that you might encounter, the common raven and the American crow, there are a few distinctions that we can use to better identify them. So the main thing to look for is that common ravens are much bigger than an American crow. They're actually about 2.5 times the size of your standard American crow. So I always tell people, if you're used to seeing crows in the city and you go out to the woods or something one weekend and you encounter something that just looks massive, it looks like the biggest crow you've ever seen, almost intimidating, then you're probably looking at a raven. And vice versa, if you're more used to seeing ravens and you see something that looks just like a baby in comparison, then it's probably a crow. We can also distinguish these birds a little bit by their preferred habitat types. So ravens are generally more wildland species. You're more likely to find them in more exclusively rural or much further away from human settlements in, the woods, so to speak. And they tend to be more specific carrion specialists, meaning they're more often going to be eating dead animals than your typical crow, which by contrast is more often going to be found in densely human populated areas like urban centers, industrial areas. They're also eating a lot more human garbage. Though these aren't, I want to be clear, these aren't hard and fast rules. Ravens can do really well in the city. There's really robust breeding populations of ravens, for example, in downtown LA and San Francisco. But generally speaking, those are kind of the trends that you can look for. There are some other physical differences besides size that can be helpful for distinguishing these birds, particularly if you see photographs of them. So crows have these really smooth throats. By contrast, ravens have these specialized elongated throat feathers that we call hackles, and they can articulate them in all different kinds of ways for visual communication display. So they can smooth them out, they can puff them up, they can also articulate the feathers on top of their head to create like little tufts, kind of like a great horned owl. So they just have a lot more sort of feather control and manipulation around their face that you can often see in photos. And even if they're not sort of puffing them out, the texture difference here, they almost look like they have this heavy beard relative to the crow. And then in flight, the easiest way to distinguish them is by the tail shape. So crows will have a more square or rounded tail shape, depending on how much they've flared out those feathers, while ravens will always have this kind of diamond shape in flight. Although it can look a little rounded, can get a little tricky, but generally speaking, this is a pretty easy read in flight. If you want a more cute way to distinguish these birds, I teamed up with Rosemary Mosca, who does the Bird and Moon comics. You might have seen her comics floating around on Facebook. She does a lot of different animals, but often with this focus on birds. She also had a great book that came out last year or the year before on watching pigeons. So she is another champion of the common bird. But her and I teamed up to create this little comic, which I recommend everyone look for and then download to your phone, as it covers some of the most helpful ways to distinguish these two birds. So with that, I want to give everyone just a little quiz to see how you might do if presented a variety of different crows and ravens. So every week on social media, especially on Wednesdays, I play this game called Crow or No, and it's a very simple premise. I'm going to show you a picture, and you just have to decide if the bird in the picture has the word crow in its recognized common name, meaning what you'd find in a field guide, or not. So pretty simple premise. The tricky part about it is that I could source these pictures from anywhere in the world, and they can reflect birds of any age. But other than that, it's a 50-50 shot every time. So here is your first bird. So take a good look and think about if you would call this a crow or a raven. Here's your second bird. The third. And finally, the fourth. So if this was a live event, I would ask for more audience participation. But as this is Zoom, I'm just going to be assuming that everyone's just madly staring at their screen, trying their best to come up with the answers. All right, so let's go over what we saw here. So the first one was actually a large-billed crow. This one always gets people. This species is really, really tricky. This is a species native across Asia. Very raven-like in proportion. They lack those hackle feathers, but you can't see that here in this photo. The main difference is the shape of the bill it's much more rounded on that top mandible than it is for a common raven, which is not to say that anything less than a crow expert should be able to get this photo, but it is a really good opportunity to just realize how diverse this family is and how much trickery can be happening on the internet. It's so easy to fool people with these different pictures of birds. Our second photo actually comes from me. I took this photo here on Tinian. So this is not a crow. There's no crows here on Tinian. This is a black noddy, which is a type of seabird. You can tell by the wing shape, those really pointed wings are much more indicative of something like a seabird, as well as the tail shape, that uneven feather distribution, good for pelagic flight, but not very characteristic of crows. Our last picture is of a common raven. There it is. You see that big heavy bill, and you can see those hints of hackles. And then the last picture, that one is a crow. This is just your standard American crow, but it has a pigmentation issue called leucism. That's basically diluting the melanin production in the feathers, creating this sort of brown. I coined them as caramel crows, but in the scientific literature, you'll see them as brown type crows. So the name's a lot less fun, so I gave them a new one. But so not a different species, just your American crow with just a funky coloration going on. These birds are, in terms of color abnormalities, leucism and leucistic birds are going to be the most common type of color abnormality you will see, much more common than, say, albinism, for example, which is a complete lack of melanin, but it's still pretty rare across the population. So it's pretty special when you do see one of these birds. All right, so now that we have a better sense of exactly what birds we're going to be talking about today, I want to dive into why I like these birds so much and what I really think that we stand to learn from them. And one of my favorite aspects of these birds is that humans as a whole, and including in the United States, are getting more and more further away from nature, right? We're becoming a more urbanized species. Most people live in cities now than in rural areas. And so our access to natural spaces is diminishing somewhat. And so that's definitely true if we look at sort of typical wild type spaces as places where we can go to find nature. But if we shift our view into thinking about where can we find nature actually in our cities, in our suburbs, then animals like crows actually provide a really important opportunity to reground people with their connections to nature. And so I encourage everybody, and I know I certainly encounter a lot of birders who maybe don't have the most positive opinions of crows. They see them eating their robin's nest or attacking other birds or attacking other wildlife and eating them. And predation is largely unappreciated, or I should say underappreciated by the public. It's hard for us to watch animals, especially ones that we have maybe been following in their journey to nest in our backyards, being attacked and eaten. But of course, that's the way that nature maintains itself, right? There are prey species and there are predator species, and sometimes crows can act as both. But if we can sort of get around our inherent knee-jerk aversion to predation, crows actually offer an incredible opportunity to connect with nature and to become better stewards and better observers of nature, because crows are often noticing the things that takes us a little bit longer to notice. And so I encourage birders, if you hear the crows making a racket, go investigate that, because that's actually probably the best indication you're going to get that there's something really interesting, like a pygmy owl or a barred owl or some kind of other predator or mesopredator in your neighborhood. So there are a couple aspects about American crow life history that I think really makes it, creates this circumstance where we can connect with them more easily than we can connect with a lot of the other, backyard birds that we might share our spaces with. So the first one, I kind of hinted at this earlier, is that American crows are what we call a cinemathropic species. So we can group birds into three kind of categories. We have the urban avoiders. So those are going to be wildland specialist birds, birds that when we cut down forests and we, urban sprawl or suburban sprawl are just out of there. We're not going to see them again. Then there's the urban adapters, and those are the kinds of birds coming to the typical backyard bird feeder, things like tits, chickadees, nuthatches, robins, those kinds of birds. They're happy to live completely in the absence of human development, but suburbia is okay for them too, and they can be pretty successful in those areas. And then the last category is the urban exploiter. And those are that's the group that our synanthropes belong to. Basically animals that not only sort of have figured out how to make it work in the human landscape, they really exploit it to their benefit. They actually actively seek it out. And that really well describes crows, because we rarely find these birds more than about 25 kilometers away from any kind of human settlement. And the reason that they do so well is that we really create the ideal environment for crows. So the things that crows like is they don't like, completely intact tracts of woods, but they like the occasional big tree to nest in. And as it happens, that is kind of the American aesthetic too, right? We don't like our neighborhoods to completely be denuded of trees, but we just have one or two here in our yard, in our neighbor's yard, just exactly the right amount for crows to nest. The other aspect of the sort of standard American aesthetic is the grass lawn. Now, if there's one thing, if you're an impassioned, steward of the land, if you really care about doing the most to benefit backyard birds, the number one thing that you could do is transition your grass lawn into native habitat, because there are very few animals. It's basically a desert in terms of habitat and food. There's very few animals that can take advantage of that space, but American crows can. They like to mine. If you've ever seen them like in a grass field at a park or potentially in your yard, you'll see them kind of walking these transects across the lawn. And what they're doing in that moment is looking for insects. And robins can do the same thing. They'll sort of mine your lawn for food, but most other animals can't take advantage of that. So they like the occasional tree, they like our grass lawns. And then the third thing that they really like is our garbage, right? Crows are very good at recognizing patterns. They'll get to know your neighborhood's local garbage schedule, and they will take advantage of that resource as it becomes available to them. So they are very much animals that are easy to find, for most Americans anywhere that we live or work. The next aspect about crows that makes them so important to this story is that they live surprisingly long time. So American crows are songbirds, so are common ravens. Common ravens are actually the biggest songbird in the world, and they have a pretty long lifespan for a songbird, anywhere from 14 to 17 years. And of course, in captivity, it can actually be quite a bit longer than this. I think the oldest recorded crow on record was 29. And so, and then the other aspect of their natural history that's so important is that they form permanent pair bonds, and as a pair, they will establish a territory, and they have very high fidelity to that territory, meaning that unless you have a migrant individual, so this gets a little bit complicated, but short version of this story is that across American crows in the United States, some of them are what we call residential birds, meaning that they live in the same place year round, and some of them are migratory. So crows are what we call a partially migratory species, where populations living in like interior Canada, where it gets incredibly harsh and cold in the winter, do actually migrate down into the United States, and then they return back up there during the breeding season. But for most of you, you probably have crows in your neighborhoods that are resident species, meaning they're there all year round. And so the advantage to that is when you go outside and you see a pair of crows, you know, sitting in the tree in front of your house or sitting on the telephone pole, it's probably the same two crows day in and day out. And that might be true for more than a decade. And that's really unique because it means that if you start to pay attention to these birds, if you go one step further and actually start to cultivate a relationship by, say, feeding them occasionally, you have an incredible opportunity to sort of make a bond and a connection and form, you know, a level of intimacy that can last a really long time. And you just can't really replicate that by, you know, putting out your standard bird feeder and, you know, watching the chickadees or the robins come in. The other factor of their life history that I think really appeals to us because it feels very familiar and we can see it reflected back on us and it's easy to interpret, is that they are cooperative breeders, actually, particularly in your part of the country. We see a little bit differences in cooperative breeding, say in the Pacific Northwest. We don't see it as often as we do on the East Coast, but I suspect where you live, I don't have specific numbers for your area, but I suspect where you live, it's kind of more like the populations we see in New York. But cooperative breeding is a fairly rare strategy where offspring from a previous year, and it's not even exclusively offspring, sometimes it's completely unrelated, you know, youngsters from previous years will come onto a territory and they will help raise the next year's brood. Now, how helpful they really are is, you know, it's up for quite a bit of debate. It doesn't seem like they do much, but it does have a net benefit to the breeding pair. Their reproductive success with these helpers around tends to be higher than birds without helpers. So how exactly their helpfulness manifests, we haven't quite sussed that out yet, but the answer is you see crows in large family groups, and it's pretty easy to see that that's what's going on. And we can really identify that with as people, right? We live in these larger family groups, or at least have them. They come in and out of our lives. And so there's just a lot of aspects to just kind of how crows are that because they're so familiar to us, because our own sort of strategies are often reflected in them, it just makes them easy to interpret in a way that maybe some other types of wildlife are just harder to connect with. So I'm glad to be having this talk in May because there is a behavior that's going to become more and more common actually in the coming months. And so this is a perfect opportunity to address this, which is this. You are minding your own business, maybe coming out of your house or walking into work, and all of a sudden you get dive bombed by a crow and you're confused. You don't know what you've done wrong. You didn't think that you were trying, you know, you certainly weren't actively harassing them. So what has happened that has caused this transgression? And the answer is that summer for crows and most other wildlife is a very stressful time of year because this is the time of year when they have kids. And one of the really interesting aspects of crow nesting strategy is that it's not uncommon for crow kids to leave the nest slightly before they're actually fully flighted. And that means that there's this window of time where they are incredibly vulnerable. They're on the ground, they can't completely fly, their parents are trying to defend them, and they don't have very many ways to do that, right? They don't have a whole lot of options when it comes to chasing away big predators from their kids. And where this intersects and causes conflicts with people is that they see us, we're these gigantic predators, obviously most people's intention is not to harm baby crows. They're probably not even aware that they're around, but this doesn't really matter for these crow parents who see us, this very powerful animal, approaching their kids. What are they to do? They try and chase us off. So if this is becoming an issue for you, in your neighborhood or close to where you work, there are a couple strategies. The most simple one, honestly, is just to carry an umbrella. If you have a really aggressive crow and it's dinging people at exactly the same spot, just carry an umbrella. It is easy. It's, you have to carry it around for probably less than 1 minute before you sort of get out of the field of conflict. And this behavior is going to resolve in a couple of weeks or a couple of months anyway. So anything beyond sort of just making the simple adjustment of carrying something to protect your head, you can even, wear a hat if that's more comfortable. It just seems like is the bare minimum of what we can do as humans, given how much land, how much space we have absorbed. If we have animals that have been able to sort of make it work and share our spaces, something like carrying an umbrella seems like a really simple offering to just make that sharing of spaces more accommodating. I really think that we owe the wildlife that does, co-live with us that. The other thing that I've seen cities do is, putting up signage can really help, because the main issue here is that people don't understand what's going on. But most people, if you just explain to them, oh, it's a stressed out parent and they have a kid, they're like, okay, I don't like it, but I get it. And that can go a long way to sort of reducing conflicts that can end in, fatalities or injuries to these birds. Speaking of kids, one comment I often get is folks feeling like they've never seen a baby crow. And you hear the same thing about baby pigeons, right? I don't know, there's pigeons everywhere. I've never seen a baby one. Did they just hatch and they just look like adults? And the answer is, of course, no, right? They're very small and ugly when they first hatch. They're altricial, like most other songbirds, meaning that they hatch naked and completely helpless. But, by the time they actually are ready to leave the nest, they're going to be covered in that all black plumage. And for most folks who aren't really paying that close attention to birds, you're probably not going to notice the difference, because they're also almost the same size as they'll hit their kind of full weight. They just won't have all of the feathers, generally speaking, unless they fledge really early. But there are a few ways, a few key features that you can look for to identify baby crows and anticipate if you might have some conflicts with parents. So here I have a classic picture. One of the easiest ways to identify baby crows is if you see a crow just screaming bloody murder at another crow in the summertime, then it's probably a baby. They are one of the most demanding of all of the kids in nature I have ever seen. It's one of my favorite things about them, actually. This kid, in fact, had just been fed by the parent in this picture and still just endlessly hungry, and it's ready for more. But one of the things that should stand out to us as we look at this picture and try and identify some features that might indicate that this is a younger bird is this pink in the mouth. So that's really one of the main features that you're going to see. When crows first hatch, the interior of their mouths and the gape, this kind of, so when baby birds first hatch, they can open their bills wider than they'll be able to as adults, and that helps facilitate parents putting food in them, so these corners aren't completely sealed. And the interior in those corners will often be a really bright color, and that's a strong signal that stimulates the parents to feed them. And in different birds, that lining is different colors. I highly recommend that you Google Gouldian finch chicks. They have these amazing bioluminescent mouth interiors. It's just wild. But crows just settled for a basic pink. So if you see this pink interior, that means you're looking at a younger bird, because that'll transition to black. There's some debate on exactly when that happens, and it might be influenced by social status, but basically within a year, it'll be mostly black. And even towards the end of summer, the interior will still be pink, and these corners will still be very pink. The other feature that you can look for is eye color. So baby crows hatch with blue eyes. By the end of summer, they'll transition to the standard brown iris, but particularly in June and July, that eye color, if you're fairly close, will really pop out to you. You'll be able to see it pretty easily. The other features to look for are shorter feathers. So their tail, the retrices, their tail feathers will not have completely come in. So they'll be very short. Baby birds grow that first batch of flight feathers much faster. And so they're always going to be of poorer quality. So we can tell a hatchier bird by the quality of its feathers. And you'll notice that in young crows, they're black, but it's this kind of dull black. It's not that beautiful shine that you see on a typical adult crow, especially right after it molts. So those are the features you can look for to identify baby crows and maybe anticipate if you're going to have some stressy parents. Again, here is just another picture. This is a slightly younger bird, so you can see that unlike this one, where the bill has completely and the legs have completely melanized, meaning turned black, here's an even younger bird. So its whole bill is a little pink, its legs are still a little pink, but that's only going to last a few days, maybe a week if it left really early. So in keeping with why are crows doing those strange things that they do, theme that we're on right now, I assume that this picture is probably very familiar to everyone in the audience. If it's not, this is a screenshot from Hitchcock's iconic movie, The Birds. Tippi Hedren is running away from this flock of terrifying crows. And, you know, it's said that Alfred Hitchcock really had reverence for this bird. In fact, I think for some period of time he had a pet raven, but there's probably no one in Western culture that has done a greater disservice to these birds than that man with this movie, because he sort of created this permanent fixture in the Western mind that seeing large groups of crows was really ominous and really creepy. And that's a big problem for crows because gathering in large numbers is a very normal part of their basic biology. So I'm going to play you a video that was taken in Bothell, which is a city just outside of Seattle. And this video depicts something that happens every night in the fall and winter. So I suspect you get the idea. It's a lot of crows, right? In fact, it's about 12,000 crows that come to this wetland area outside of the UW Bothell campus. There's this wetland right out, like riparian area right outside of the stream. And every night in the fall and winter is a huge gathering of crows. And so, like I said, having this sort of fixture in our mind that, you know, seeing large groups of crows is creepy is a real problem, because this is a very basic part of their behavior. And what it is communal roosting. And communal roosting, kind of like cooperative breeding, we see in a variety of species, from starlings to American robins. And basically, it's a pretty simple idea. Sleeping, which is what, you know, these kinds of birds sleep at night, is a pretty vulnerable time, right? So you are much better off trying to sleep in a bigger group, having this big communal slumber party, than you are just sort of making your way on your own. And that's all communal roosting is. It's this gathering of individuals. It probably has a lot of layers of social opportunity that's involved with it too. But at its heart, it is an anti-predator strategy that keeps birds safer at night. And so wherever you live in the United States, if you have crows, there are going to be certain areas near you that are going to be the gathering places for these communal roosts. And I don't know exactly where they are outside of, you know, I know where our roosts are in Seattle. I know in Boston, there's a really dedicated group of crow watchers, or not in Boston, excuse me, in Lawrence, but there's a group of crow watchers that come down from Boston and have been monitoring the roosts in Lawrence for a number of years. So there's probably a group in your area that is dedicated to watching your local crow roosts. And they should be, because to me, roosting really represents this incredible wildlife spectacle that I think that we often covet, right? If you watch Planet Earth or any of those series and you see the wildebeest migration or the caribou or the monarch butterflies, there's something really inspiring about seeing movements of large groups of animals. And it can feel like if you live in a city, you have very little opportunity to experience something like that. But if you identify where your local crow roost is, you can, and you can see it really easily and really reliably. And it is an incredibly moving thing to watch animals engage in this enormous social affair. So I strongly encourage you, check in on eBird, look in with your local, birders, and see if you can identify where your local roost is and spend an evening watching them. And I promise you won't regret it. The size of roosts can really vary. Like I mentioned, we have two roosts in Seattle, and they both kind of vacillate anywhere between 10,000 and 15,000 birds. They can be much bigger than that. Historically, the largest roosts were over 300,000 birds. We don't really see roosting that large anymore in the United States, partly because, particularly on the East Coast, crow populations took an enormous hit from an outbreak of West Nile virus. But it's also just because the landscape has changed, and areas that would support roosts that are that big just are a little bit harder to come by. So we mostly find slightly smaller roosts, but they're still incredibly exciting. So that's kind of all that I wanted to cover in terms of their basic natural history. Hopefully that covered a lot of the questions that you came here with. We'll also have a Q&A session at the end. But for now, I want to transition to some aspects of their behavior that for the North American, crow fan might be a little bit harder to see, because our American crows don't really exhibit these behaviors, but they're very exciting. And they've been one of the most useful insights into the evolution of cognition and really these birds at large. So I want to play you a little video of a really famous crow named Betty. And Betty is a New Caledonian crow. New Caledonia, if you've never heard of it, is a small island off the coast of New Zealand. And it's a special place because on New Caledonia, kind of like Hawaii, there are no woodpeckers. There's no native woodpeckers, which means that there's this whole food niche of big grubs and other insects kind of hiding under the bark and in the crevices of dead logs or whatever that aren't being exploited or weren't being exploited by another bird. But, unlike woodpeckers who have this really unique physiology that protects them while they hammer into wood, crows don't have that, right? So they'd get traumatic brain injury if they just went, hog wild, trying to rip open a log to get after some bugs. So they had to be a little bit more creative on New Caledonia. So New Caledonian crows are actually the only species of crow and one of only two species of birds that we've seen make tools in the wild. Just recently, there was a parrot that they demonstrated was actually regularly making tools in the wild. But until very recently, they were second, really only to chimpanzees for their ability to make tools. And so the tools that they make, there's this plant that grows in New Caledonia called pandanus plant. And we actually have them here on Tinian too. They've got these really kind of thick leaves with these incredibly sharp serrated edges. So what they do is they peel off just a segment of that edge, and then they'll shape it to whatever shape they want, and then they use that to kind of stick it into the the bark crevices, and the insects bite it. There's the kind of harass insects, they bite it or they kind of hook them and they pull it out and they eat them. And that is astounding. Like I said, that only less than 1% of all animals use tools, but even a smaller number, basically limited to New Caledonian crows, humans, chimpanzees, and then we've seen some animals do it in captivity, actually make tools. So that using tools and making tools is a really important distinction. But it's still our interest as folks looking at animal cognition to understand, so when an animal does something really incredible like that, does it actually understand what it's doing, or is it sort of just kind of going through the motions of some mechanism? Which brings us to Betty. So they had caught these New Caledonian crows, brought them in to run a suite of behavioral experiments to try and understand how much these birds actually knew about the tools that they were making. So they've presented Betty with a task that we use with people, we use with chimpanzees, we change it a little bit, but that is trying to get at the heart of this question. So, and this will be it'll be easier to see when I play the video, but basically you have this clear cylinder. At the bottom of the cylinder is a little tiny bucket, right, with food in it. And Betty and her cage mate have been given 2 tools to try and get that bucket out of the cylinder. They've been given a hook and they've been given a straight piece of wire. And in both cases, this is their first time interacting with these materials. Unfortunately for Betty, her cage mate took the hook and flew away. He didn't really feel like participating in this experiment. And so right now the researchers are just like banging their heads. They're so frustrated. They just want this to work. And Betty, you know, she has her straight piece of wire. She's clearly very hungry. She wants to get at this food, but you know, what is she to do? Okay, then. So you might imagine that for the people running this experiment, where the question was, could she correctly choose hook over straight wire, to have that not work, but then to have her spontaneously make the hook, even though she'd never used that material before, was astonishing. And it still is. That said, we actually know now that New Caledonian crows make hooks all the time. It's actually one of the tools in their toolkit, and it's a really cool process the way they do it. But anyway, we can save that for another talk. Amazing. I mean, nobody else makes hooks besides us. So like this is absolutely astounding that a crow is capable of making a hook spontaneously in this kind of situation and in the wild. And so that brings us to this question of, how do we actually go about measuring intelligence? Because it's kind of a dicey question, right? And you can rightfully ask, you know, who are we as human beings to try and measure the intelligence of other animals? How can we possibly make that assessment without it being completely colored and biased by our own experience of what being intelligent is? And there is a great conversation to be had there. There's probably some very good critiques and criticisms of how we do that, but we are just trying to do our best. And so what that looks like in this moment is we have identified what we've called the Cognitive Toolkit. And what this toolkit is trying to encompass is features and behaviors that we know cannot be replicated with anything other than cognition, right? It can't be achieved with trial and error learning. It can't be achieved by simple mechanisms. These are things that we know are driven by cognition. So the 4 things in our toolkit are causal reasoning. So an understanding of cause and effect. So for example, that picture. So for example, a gull might find a clam on a beach and it'll fly it up in the air and drop it, hoping to bust it open and eat the contents, right? And you can look at that behavior and go, oh yeah, that's really smart. That seagull's really cracked that one, really figured that one out. But the trick there is that if you look at sort of the patterns of seagulls doing that, if you present them with like, okay, here's a sandy surface and here's an asphalt surface or a water surface, which one are you going to choose to drop your net? They don't really pick the hard asphalt surface or the rock more than would be expected by chance, because even though they've learned that flying something up in the air and dropping it works, they don't actually understand why, the relationship between dropping it and the hard surface. While crows, on the other hand, will really consistently make the right choice there. So that's causal reasoning sort of fully manifested. The other feature of our cognitive toolkit is imagination. So this is one that we often take for granted as people because we're constantly imagining things. I literally, the only limitation to my imagination is that I can't imagine what it would be like to not imagine things. But it's an incredibly difficult cognitive thing to do, right? To picture things that aren't real, that aren't happening right now. And so we don't have evidence that most animals are capable of sort of imagining scenarios that haven't happened in the way that humans and some other animals are. The other feature is flexibility. So the classic example that you would learn in school is gray-legged geese nest on the ground like most waterfowl. And if one of their eggs, you know, as she's moving in and off of the nest, if she accidentally kicks one of her eggs off the nest, it would die, right? So she needs to get it back in. So gray-lag geese, if an egg accidentally gets rolled out of the nest, she'll go and she'll use her bill to kind of push it back in. You look at that and you're like, well, that's smart, right? Because if she didn't do that, her chick would die. And so she must understand what's going on there. But where we see that sort of falls short of this intelligence idea is that if you put anything outside of a gray-lag goose nest, an orange or a rock or a golf ball, she'll roll it back in because she doesn't have any flexibility over that behavior. It's a very simple stimulus response mechanism. And it lacks that causal reasoning where she's not thinking like, oh, my egg is out here. This is my egg. I know it's my egg because blah, blah, blah. It's just, you know, in nature, the likelihood of something besides an egg being right outside of her nest is so small, it's never really evolved that level of understanding. She doesn't really need to for that behavior to be really successful and really useful to her and her species. And then the last feature is what we call prospection, which is just a fancy word for mental time travel, basically reflecting on past experiences and using it to plan for future ones. So I want to take a minute to just kind of walk through some of these different features of the toolkit and how we've been able to demonstrate them in crows and other corvids. So this first one looks at causal reasonings. It's one of my favorite suite of studies that have been done. Again, focusing on New Caledonian crows. And often if you see big headlines in popular science publications, big headlines about how crows smarter than an 8-year-old kid or crows blah, blah, blah. It's probably a study that was done on New Caledonian crows as opposed to our American crows. But anyway, this suite of studies focused in on the Aesop's fable of the crow in the pitcher, which if you're unfamiliar with that, it's basically the story of a thirsty crow comes across a pitcher of water. The water is so low though, the crow can't reach it. And so it gathers up a bunch of stones, drops it in the pitcher, and the water level raises so that it can take a sip. And so these scientists said, all right, challenge accepted. Let's see if they can actually do it. And so the video will walk you through the different experiments, but I'll kind of chime in here and there as I need to. So again, sorry, I'll stop it just right away, annoyingly quickly. Very similar setup to the initial one we saw with Betty, where you have this cylinder and there's water and there's a floating piece of food. And the idea is the crow wants to get at that food, but it can't reach it. So it's got to use some of these objects to try and get at that food. I'm so sorry. So in this one, we have our wide tube and our narrow tube. If you were trying to, solve this problem as efficiently as possible, you would target the narrow tube because you'd need fewer rocks to more quickly raise the water level. Crows don't seem to quite get this. No matter how much experience we give them with this, they always they never pick the more narrow tube, more than would be expected by chance. In my experience, high school students are also really bad at this. So we'll give the crow a pass on this one. So this last one is called the hidden connections test. And I want to take a minute to explain it to you because it's hidden, right? So you can't quite see what the experiment is, but basically under this platform, what you'd be able to see is that this red tube and the narrow one in the middle are connected to you. The food is in this narrow tube, and this tube is too narrow for the crow to actually drop its rocks directly in here. It has to put it in either the red or the blue tube. So the question is, with a little bit of experimentation, will the crow figure out that when it drops rocks in the red tube, the water level on the narrow one raises, versus when it drops it in the blue tube, nothing happens? So can it do a little experimenting, figure out that even though it can't see why, these two tubes are connected? And what we found with the hidden connections test is kind of like the previous one. No matter how much experience we give crows with that, they'll never figure out the connection more than would be expected by chance. And, you know, if you give them enough rocks, they'll just keep dropping them until they finally get the treat. But if you do ever see headlines, you know, crows as smart as 8-year-old kids or crows as smart as children, it's that test actually is one of the contributing nuggets of truth to that statement, because it's only when we are about 8 years old that we can start to accurately and predictably solve hidden connections tests, which is, again, amazing. I mean, like, the idea that crows would at all compare to humans at any point in our development surprises a lot of people, particularly because it's really only in the last couple of decades that we had any appreciation at all. And when I say we, I mean, you know, Western scientists, but, you know, that there was any appreciation at all for the intelligence of birds. You know, we're all probably familiar with the insult of being bird-brained. There was a very long-held assumption that birds couldn't be very intelligent. There's a whole, you know, suite of reasons for that, which I have a whole nother talk about, but the main reason is that their brains are just very different than ours. And by ours, I mean humans and mammals at large. And so we just assumed that if their brains were so different, they couldn't possibly achieve the same mental feats that a mammalian brain could. And now we know much better. In terms of imagination, my favorite study that's looked at this in common ravens did this. It was really beautifully simple in their approach. Basically, ravens will cache food. They hide it away for later. And we know by watching wild ravens and ravens in captivity that they don't like being watched as they hide food, because theft is a real issue, right? If you hide a really tasty morsel and another raven watches you, you leave your cache, that other raven might come in and steal it. So they have a very particular, you know, way that they behave if they think they're being watched. That was all known already prior to this study, but they took advantage of that behavioral sort of exhibit to ask a question about whether or not crows might imagine that they're being watched, even if they didn't have any proof. So what they did is they had these captive, you know, these are captive hand-reared ravens at one of the behavioral institutes in Austria. And they put it in this enclosure, this big enclosure, and they gave it you know, stuff in there to play with, and they put up a partition with a second enclosure. And so to start with, what they did is they would have the raven go on one side and the researcher that it knows and is familiar with go on the other side. And in that partition, they drilled a little peephole. And so to start with, they would have the researchers go and it would call the raven's name, and the raven would hop up and it would be like, oh, what? And it would look through the peephole. So we've established them, we've given them the experience that they can look through peepholes. So then the next phase is they would put them in their side of the enclosure. We would give them some food to cache, and they would play calls of a raven on the other side. And the question was, if they played the calls with the peephole closed versus if they played the calls with the peephole open. And the reason that's important, the reason why they played calls instead of like putting another bird on the other side, is one of the criticisms that had come prior to this study from other studies trying to achieve a similar thing, is that as long as the raven could see the other competitor, it might be changing its behavior as a result of the gaze effect. So you need some meaning, like being, it could see the eyes of the other bird. So there's no way to sort of test this imagination idea. So playing calls eliminated that criticism. And what they found is if they played those calls and the peephole was shut, the raven on the other side with the food acted as if it was alone, as if it wasn't being watched, and it cached in that manner. But if they opened the peephole, even though it couldn't actually see another raven on the other side, it could just hear it, it acted like it was being watched. And what that suggests is that ravens could remember that experience that they had had of looking through the peephole to see that researcher, and they could infer and imagine that the same thing might be happening to them now, even though they couldn't see the other bird, that it could be using that peephole to spy on them. And lastly, flexibility and prospection. Most of this work has not been done on crows or ravens, but actually jays, particularly scrub jays. And in these studies, basically what we do is they'll give jays in this particular group that this image is depicting, you give scrub jays mealworms, they cache them, and then you give them some rotten mealworms, basically to teach them that all of the mealworms that they have cached have gone bad. And you do that for your experimental group, and in your control group, they are under the impression that the mealworms will last as long as they're used to. And what we find is that if these birds get new information about the integrity of that food that they'd previously cached, they dig it up and eat it much faster than if they haven't. And so what that suggests is not only that they're flexible, right? They're not operating on a very particular schedule, but they can use those past experiences and then make adjustments to their future plans. So those are kind of the different suites of experiments that have suggested to us that crows and ravens and other corvids have this sort of mental cognitive toolkit that really puts them on par with the intelligence of, ourselves and the great apes at different levels. The last thing that I want to talk about with our last 10 minutes here is some of the work that I focused on as a graduate student, which looked at their funerals. So believe it or not, crows have a very distinctive and predictable way that they respond to finding a dead crow. And typically what that looks like is the first bird that finds the dead body will produce an alarm call that attracts other birds to the area. They'll get together in a big group, making this scolding sound. If you've ever seen them go after an eagle or a hawk, you're probably familiar with this. And then that's more or less the bulk of the behavior. And humans have known that crows have done this for a very long time. In fact, we can see references to it in ancient religious texts like the Quran. So the idea that they had funerals, that wasn't new. I didn't contribute that to science. People have known that for a long time. But I was interested in really better understanding this behavior from an adaptive standpoint. And of course, we see that an interest in dead occurs across a variety of animals, from the cetaceans, dolphins, and whales who might carry dead calves, to primates. Elephants are probably the most familiar to most people because of their interest in their dead, even to the point that they've been reduced to bones. And then the last group that is maybe less familiar to people, but is actually the one that we've studied the most, is the social insects, things like ants and bees and termites, which we know have really rigorous, what we call undertaking behaviors, or ways that they respond and how they dispose of their dead. So through those different animals, we can kind of group them into two categories. So there's those that have been systematically studied. We've actually done experiments on them. So again, the social insects, some small mammals like mice, and then some birds. And then there's a group of animals that our observations of what they do are primarily anecdotal, right? They are reports from civilians or scientists of spontaneous death in nature and then describing what has happened. And that group encompasses most of the big intelligent mammals like elephants, non-human primates, and cetaceans. But corvids are really interesting because they kind of fall somewhere in the middle of this diagram, right? We have some systematic studies, but we also have a lot of really interesting anecdotal stories. And so because they're so much easier to study than some of these bigger mammals, they make a really good model for asking questions about why animals might take this keen interest in their dead. And so there are a variety of ways that I wanted to sort of get at that. And one thing that I should say now, before anybody misinterprets, is that these behaviors are probably very complicated. There's probably a variety of things that drive their interest in their dead, but they're not all testable, right? If crows are reacting strongly to a dead crow because they're sad, because it's an expression of grief, that might very well be happening, but that's not something that at this point we have the ability to test scientifically. But there are other explanations that we can. And so by sort of chipping away at all of the possibilities, we can start to unpack what might be driving this behavior. So the things that I looked at was how they respond, trying to sort of quantify what happens generally during these funerals. Again, what is the adaptive value of their response? And I look specifically at danger learning. Maybe the reason they're so keen on responding to their dead is it's an important cue for them to assess the danger in their environment, what kinds of features they pay attention to. So are they paying attention to the age, for example, of the bird at the time it dies? This sort of question of context is one of the ways that we've explained why there's so much variability in how animals like primates, for example, respond. And then the last question was what mediates their behavior? What's actually going on in their brain? So for that first question of how and why do they respond, what we did is we identified a variety of breeding pairs across the city of Seattle. We would feed them for a couple of days to establish kind of the baseline of how quickly they would come down for food. And then we would introduce our funeral element, which was generally a person wearing a mask, holding a dead crow, sort of standing at the food. And so we would monitor, what that event looked like, how many birds showed up, how long they scolded, yada, yada, yada. But then the sort of key question was what happens after? So the next day when we go to feed them again, this person's not here, the dead crow is not there. How quickly did they come down? Is it as if, the day before had never happened, or do we see an increase in their level of wariness? And we found that they were much warier to come down to the food following these events. If they ever saw this person again, they also treated them like a predator versus before, they would have just ignored them. Now we find that even up to 6 weeks after this event, if they see this person, they treat them like a predator. Now, if you're thinking, look at that horrible face, anyone would treat that person as a predator, they're terrifying. Fear not, we ran controls. I know that they're really creepy. But crows, believe it or not, don't seem to think they're creepy until they actually see them holding a dead crow. If you want to learn more about that study, you can find it on my blog, but we published it a few years ago. Next, we asked what they are attentive to. So again, that idea of context is, with primates, for example, we see that the way that they manifest their behavior if they encounter a dead primate is they might groom it, they might attack it, they might get sexually aroused. There's all different kinds of ways that they manifest that experience. And so why? In one instance, why do they just sit quietly by the body? And in this other instance, they attacked it viciously. And so this idea of context is right now our best explanation for that. So I wanted to look at just one aspect of context, which is age. If indeed crows are using dead crows as cues of danger, then age would actually be a very relevant thing for them to pay attention to, because young crows are much more likely to die. Survivorship that first year is only about 50% relative to a sexually mature crow, whose year-to-year survivorship can be closer to 80%. So if you see a dead kid, in other words, if you see a dead kid, that's a bummer, especially if it's your kid. But you're not necessarily like, oh no, there's something horrible in the environment, because unfortunately dead kids are, kids are naive. And so they're more likely to, experience mortality relative to a very experienced adult, where if they're dead, there's probably a really dangerous predator around. And we found that indeed they do pay more attention to adults, particularly in the breeding season when their behavioral responses are more constrained because they're busy with other things. We also found something a little bit unexpected, which is that until this experiment, all of the funeral stuff we had done involved having a person hold the dead crow. So the other crows, that were attending never really got too close. But in that contextual experiment, we would just put dead crows on the sidewalk. These are stuffed dead crows, by the way. They're also all unfamiliar birds, which might change their behavior somewhat. So it's an important caveat to recognize. But we would just put these crows on the sidewalk and see how they respond. And we found that in the spring, they do something quite different than what we see them do in the winter. So here we have a dead crow by a nesting pair. This is the first mate. I can't tell you which is male and which is female, but so these are the two partners. So a lot to unpack there, way more than we really have time for. But basically, in a nutshell, what you're seeing is an incredible confluence of sexual behavior, alarm behavior, and aggressive behavior. And this level of complexity where you had a mated pair coming in, copulating with the dead crow, with each other, we only saw one other time. But sexual behavior was, you know, it was rare, but it happened about 4% of the time. And contact of any type, whether it was sort of just pecking at the feathers or ripping them to pieces, happened over 30% of the time. So clearly there's something happening in the spring that's informing this suite of really strange behaviors that doesn't seem to be going on in the fall. This paper came out a few years later in 2018. So again, if you're interested in all of the details, you can find it on my blog. But basically what we think might be happening is that during the springtime, you know, these birds are getting just inundated with novel hormones, right, as they go to enter the breeding season. And it may just be sort of arresting their ability to deal with conflicting stimulus like a dead crow, right? And the reason it's conflicting is because if you see a competitor on your territory, as a breeding pair, you want to get them off the territory, right? Because if they're hanging around, they might try and attempt to copulate with the female or whatever. So you're like, get out of here. But then it's dead, right? So you're like, oh no, this is scary. But they're also breeding and they do engage in these extra pair copulations. So they're like, another crow. So it's very complicated. And so it may just be that the hormones are informing this sort of strange decision-making or displacement behaviors that we don't see in other times of the year. But we don't really know. There's so much to unpack there. And again, it doesn't happen often, but it happens enough that it inspires some interesting questions. The last thing that I'll go over really quickly in terms of these studies was we did a really interesting brain study of what crows, of what parts of their brains crows are using as they process information about dead crows. I won't go into the details, but suffice it to say, this is a really clever non-lethal study. So the birds that participate, at the end of it, they get released back into the wild, which is pretty rare when it comes to neurology studies. Most of the time we have to euthanize animals to get the data. But in these cases, we use a PET imaging approach that allows us to use a living bird, look at its brain activity, and then back into the wild it goes after. What we found through these studies was that when crows see a dead crow, again, unfamiliar, it might be a little different, they don't use the part of their brain that we would expect them to if they were having a strong emotional response. So when you show people pictures of dead humans, particularly loved ones, the part of our brain that lights up is the amygdala. Crows have a amygdala homologue, and we don't see that that's the part of their brain they use when they see dead crows. Instead, they're tapping their analog to the prefrontal cortex, which is the decision-making part of their brain, which, given what we found in some of our other experiments, kind of makes sense, right? They're clearly taking a lot of information about dead crows and using that to inform their behavior. So the fact that that's the part of their brain that's getting tapped, particularly in the environment of being in this weird room and being in this weird situation and seeing a dead crow and then having someone look at their brain, there's probably a lot of higher order thinking that's happening to unpack all of that. So the very last thing, I know I keep saying that, that I want to end with is kind of bringing this all together to until now, all of the experiments I've described, it's basically us observing crows, right? Us watching crows and taking things away from those observations. But the thing that makes this connection that we have with crows and the opportunity they're so different and important than most other wildlife is it's actually very reciprocal. Crows are very much watching us in a similar way to how we watch them. And I took this picture a few years ago on the University of Washington campus above the library, and it's a little bit hard to see, but you can kind of look on top of this statue, all around it, the maintenance crews have installed bird spikes to try and prevent this exact thing from happening. But rather than being put off by it, the crows have sort of used these bird spikes as rebar to reinforce their nest. And it's a good reminder that, you know, whether we like it or not, crows are really sort of building their worlds on our backs. And so we can fight them and complain that they ate our robin's nest and all, you know, this, that, and the other. But it's much more fun if you just sort of give in to appreciating them as normal parts of your local ecosystems, as normal predators, and enjoying all of the features of their behaviors that can come from that. And one of the most important aspects about crows that really allow for that relationship is the fact that they, like I said, they're watching us, but they're learning us in a really individualized way, because crows are very good at distinguishing different people from our faces. So they can learn you if you threaten them in some way, and they'll, you know, make you pay for it for years, decades after your initial transgression, like we saw in my funeral study, but we've also shown that with a variety of other studies too. But they also will learn to recognize you if you are nice to them, if you feed them. So this is one of my favorite stories that I'll leave you with. There was a gentleman who lived outside of Seattle who would feed the crows every day, had a little platform. And one day, you know, he went out and he was like putting out his chicken scraps or whatever. And he said, you know, every day I bring you all this really nice food and you don't ever bring me anything. Sort of huffs back inside. And then, you know, a little while later, he would always go to make sure that they'd cleaned up all the food. That's really important if you're feeding birds. You don't want to attract rats. And he saw that while all the food was gone on his feeding platform, in its stead was one of those little candy hearts that said, the little starchy Valentine hearts that said love on it. And he was just really taken aback. I mean, almost fearful because he thought, am I going crazy? I said this thing to the crow and it seemed like they heard me. And so he reached out to John Marsloff, who was my graduate advisor with the story, and basically said, I need you to tell me if I'm going, you know, nuts or not, because this happened to me and I need to understand if crows actually heard me. And the answer is, you know, obviously I can't tell you for sure if crows understand written or oral human language. I doubt that they can, but this phenomenon of gifting is very real. And there are a lot of people across the country who feed crows who have reported this experience of getting objects from the crows that they feed. Now, whether or not that's truly a demonstration of gratitude remains to be seen. Maybe it's that crows simply, you know, carry objects around with them that they're a little bit curious about. And then if they see food, they make the exchange. But we don't know for sure. So in the meantime, I say, if this has ever happened to you, enjoy it. It is magical no matter the cost. And it's, again, just one of those other really unique experiences that these birds offer. And so if you're interested in you know, making crow friends, you're welcome to ask me questions after the talk. We are a little bit over time, so I'm going to end things there. And please, I'm happy to stick around for a little bit longer if anybody has any questions that they would like to ask. And thank you for joining me today. And if there aren't any questions folks want to pipe up with or put in the chat, maybe, but you know, you want to just kind of let it marinate and reach out to me later. I'll leave my contact here. You can find me on social media at the Corvid Research handle, on my blog, corvidresearch.blog. I have a ton of articles about different stuff, so you're welcome to tap me there. I'm pretty good at responding to messages. Might take me a few days. But I see that there is Ethan has asked, why did they evolve so much intelligence? That's kind of the big question. But one hypothesis is that being social is really hard. So if we look at the most social animals, things like elephants, primates, whales, corvids, we see that theme of higher intelligence. And so it may be that achieving these really high functioning societies, the way that these different animals have, just requires a really intense level of cognition. Maybe on the other hand, it's related to food. Animals that have more generalized diets also kind of tend to show that pattern. And that's because, being able to eat a whole variety of different things, test new things, requires a higher level of cognition. So there's a whole variety of answers to that question. We don't know the answer yet, Ethan, but it's definitely the $1 million one. So if you figure it out, please let me know. All right, seems like that wraps us up. Again, thank you so much for spending your evening coming out here to talk about crows. I wish everybody a great weekend and stay with the birds.